morning, everyone. This is the point where we're beginning to wrap up our conference. And we'd like to hear from you now what you have learned and what you would like to learn that we haven't covered. So if you want to raise your hand and make a comment, I'm going to ask John if he'll wander around with his mobile mic and pick you up. Anyone like to begin? What have you learned?
If you don't volunteer, I'm going to make a selection.
I assume none of you were asleep this weekend, so you must have learned something new from some speaker along the way. I know I did. I learned quite a bit about the immigration of Scots to various parts of North America, but I'd also personally like to hear more about the island cultures in Scotland. We quite often forget the Shetlands, the Orkneys, and the Hebrides because they're quite different in some of their culture.
So, is this thing on? Let's. Okay. One of the things I picked up here, and was not a big surprise, was how much skepticism we should be addressing any of our sources, be they the phone book, the DNA, the genealogy, the traditions. And I'd like to bring a story to you that has absolutely nothing to do with Scots. But several years ago, I was part of a epidemiology project where we were looking at a particular disease among the Amish of northern Indiana that consisted of a triad of mild mental retardation, low fertility among the males, relatively low, which means in the Amish community you only have 3 or 4 kids instead of the 12 that you're supposed to have, and bad hair. And these people had hair that would be very, very brittle. And so we developed a test that was very easy to look at, where we could just look at the hair and tell whether somebody was a affected person, a carrier, or unaffected. It was a simple autosomal recessive. And so I was the person in charge of doing the hair work. And I came up with this one group that was just not going according to plan. As I recall, both parents were homozygous, and at least one of the kids was heterozygous. And I went to the geneticist who was in charge of the project, and he looked at me for a while, and he said, "Check the people on the neighboring farms." And so I did, and it turns out, and at the point he said that to me, I said, "Come on, these are Amish people. These people invented social control, and they watch each other like hawks." And he said, "Yeah, check the neighboring farms." And then when we finally figured out, he looked at me and he said, in any of these sorts of projects, you probably should expect about a 15% illegitimacy rate. Yeah, and that holds true in some work we've done since then, and so consider that.
Very good, thank you. Anyone else?
Next. Aha, Bruce.
Yes. Actually, I did once in Pennsylvania, and somebody told me a great joke. It was, what goes clip clop, bang bang, clip clop? It's an Amish drive-by shooting. Okay. Listen, there's a wonderful quote that I use a lot, and I don't know who said it. I can only tell you it wasn't Mark Twain, despite what Google will say. And it goes like this: "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's know for sure that just ain't so." Right? Certainty is our enemy. The open mind is our friend. Where this bites deepest for me is in people often confront me with what I can call narratives of victimhood. There's something about the American Scots psyche that wants to believe they were kicked out for some reason. We were religiously persecuted. We were cleared off our land. It's hardly ever true. Most people just left because they could. Now, Andrew will say, where's Andrew? Getting coffee. He will say, yeah, but being economically challenged and having no future in Scotland, that's pretty tantamount to being kicked out effectively, to an extent. But the British government actually they were worried about how many people were emigrating to Australia, because it wasn't the destitute, it wasn't the lowlifes, it was the intelligentsia, it was the trained people, it was the artisans, it was the wheelwrights and the barrel makers. They were the ones who were leaving. And the farmers, they would wait till the harvest, they would collect the harvest, they'd sell it, they'd sell all the possessions, and they'd try and get across the Atlantic before the winter storms set in. So they landed here with some money, the ability to set themselves up. And the government collected their stated reasons for leaving. And the ones that spring out as being almost universal were the price of land went up, we couldn't afford it, the price of cereal went up, so we couldn't afford to make or buy bread, etc., etc. And it's just too economically challenging. So we're going over there where we're getting, these are what we call push factors. They were pull factors, like they were being offered not exactly free land, but tax redemptions and the opportunity to get more land. And when the Scots got to America, they discovered something that they just didn't know about. And that was trees. You get this view of Scotland as being this sort of wooded paradise. It really wasn't. Scots have spent 10,000 years cutting down every tree in Scotland. But when they got to America, they suddenly found something. Who was it said yesterday? They could burn it for fuel. They could build houses from it. Also, they could tap the trees for pitch and tar and sell that to the guys making boats and so on. And I always think the single major thing that helped the Scots get established in America was the fact that the Finns and the Swedes got there before them, because they knew how to build log cabins. And there's utterly no tradition in Scotland of building log cabins. My friend will now disagree with every single part of that.
I'm not going to disagree with log cabins. I'm sure there's some truth in that. But, it's very fashionable now. There's a kind of revisionist history going on that says the clearances basically didn't really happen, or that people were just delighted to move to America for wonderful new opportunities. I can remember the chief of Clan Ranald at a games in Loch Norman, not the one we were at with the red mud, but an earlier one, was flogging a booklet that he'd written that claimed that that the people left of their own accord and they were just delighted to come to America. And I think the case of Clan Ranald is particularly telling, because they were certainly given little choice in the matter, and people who refused to go were manacled and thrown on board the ships. So the clearances certainly happened, and the removal of the trees certainly happened, and in some cases the removal of the people and the removal of the trees were connected. If you're proud to be an American who enjoys your national parks, I'm sure you're proud of that great Scotsman John Muir. And the first national park was created because John Muir heard that sheep farmers planned to take over the Yosemite area. And whereas that might not have been concerning for the local population who knew nothing about sheep, coming from Scotland, he understood exactly the devastation that sheep create. And they leave nothing higher than blades of grass around. They destroy all the trees, the young saplings. And that is indeed what happened. And when people go back to Scotland, they look at the Highlands and they say, oh, how pretty, but it could never have sustained much population. This is just beautiful wilderness area. They don't understand that the sheep and the deer grass were not there to begin with, and these places were turned over and either to sheep or to become shooting estates for the wealthy. and they did support a population, maybe not very well, but they supported a population for hundreds of years beforehand on a cattle rearing economy. And the one of the as a little indicator of this, one of the mottos in my arms that were chosen by my grandfather is it says Cherno Mavukale, which means the Lord is my shepherd. But I, being a sort of classicist, I looked at the word vukale or bukale without the aspiration and said, well, this is awfully like the Greek word bukalos, which means cowherd. And indeed, there were no sheep in the Highlands and Islands, and therefore, when they wanted to translate that passage from the Psalm, they had to say, the Lord is my cowherd. And that's what it says in Gaelic, Cherno Movukale, or literally the laird, or my landlord is my cowherd. So, yes, devastation, destruction of trees, and people being removed from their houses. There is a kind of, in employment law, if somebody leaves a company, but they were effectively, you created a hostile work environment so that they had no option, it doesn't really matter whether you say you fired them or not. They get to sue you, and so you can sue the people who kicked you out.
Thank you.
Your question was, what had I found the most inspiring or whatever? I have to say, Bart Forbes' work on the Forbes clan book and what he's done to pull that together, I think is inspiring for all of us. That's beautifully done. It's great. It's really readable, and I think if that can be a template for others to follow and do and have for their clans, that would be great. And I was so glad that he had a chance to present that to us and explain his journey in that way. So congratulations, Bart.
Anyone else?
When we were first looking at conference themes, Gus and I talked about something that he had actually read about, and I seized on it, and I said I thought we should work it into the conference. It became a little difficult to do because we couldn't find enough material to do it, but I just want to put it out there because I think it's a very important notion. He said he had read one or more articles, sociological articles, about the connection between exploring your roots and building leadership skills. And whoever the author was the premise was that people who had explored who they were and where they came from were stronger personalities, able to exert leadership in whatever field they were working in, more self-confident, and all the rest. You can see where that's going. It makes perfect sense to me, but then, I'm interested in my roots. I think all of you are. You would be sitting here this weekend talking about this. I would like to see us try to locate that article and other articles like it. I'm sure there's a body of literature about it, and make it available, whether it's online or whatever. Because, this is we were talking yesterday about what do you do with this? So what? Okay, but we're in the 21st century. You look backward, you bring it forward, you live it, but to what purpose? And I think if it can be shown that it helps build leadership skills and self-confidence and other things, that's a good thing. If you watch Henry Louis Gates' program, Finding Your Roots, it's one of the most popular programs on public television, and it's not limited to any ethnic group. African Americans, Jews, Hispanics, Europeans, Asians, Japanese, they're all interested in their roots, and they're all able to find, something of value in that. That's pretty universal then, in terms of human nature. So let's take this, which I think was a very good weekend, and build on it with some of that stuff. Make it available on the website or the next time we get together, whatever, so that it's grounded and and it doesn't just kind of float away on us. That's my thought.
Anyone else?
Bob, here you go.
Well, first off, it's a great pleasure to be in the company of the Viscount. That in itself is a treat. Americans love their Viscounts. But more importantly, I want to thank Viscount Driscoll and Russell for bringing up Friday night this concept of the ship of Theseus as a great philosophical question. And of course, it says something to the fact that if an object has its elements replaced over time, is it the same object? Briefly, I have been very intimately connected to that painting on the wall for a long time, and I have seen the tiny little pieces, the 40 pieces we were left with. And in my mind, it's always been the Robert Hopkins painting. Now, after this weekend, it's now maybe a little more of the Victor Ashmianis who reconstructed the painting. And I don't know the percentage yet. I'll work that out in my mind over time. But it really put focus on something that, for me, has been a long project. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Bob. You know, and that statement brings me back to the quote that Charlie had, the Scott quote, "My heart clings to the place I created." That's an interesting, very interesting quote.
That really resonates with me because I think that's what our job is in the Scottish American Scottish community. We have fragments of our heritage, the fragments of our families, and it's really up to us to reconstruct that and to bring that together. If Sir Walter Scott destroyed the Highland myth, perhaps it is our responsibility to bring all that together for the next generation. So thank you for that. That's what connected in my head immediately.
There's an important genealogical point to what's been said recently, what Andrew said. I mean, sure, the Highland clearances happened. Nobody's Holocaust denying that. They were a feature largely of the stand-up of the 19th century, the early 1800s. And quite often people were actually put off their land. They went to the coast, and then subsequently, when they couldn't make a living on the coast for a variety of reasons, not least the removal of tariff barriers, actually, they went to America. But the century before that had been typified by lowland clearances, which were actually larger in terms of the number of population. They were deeper in terms of the impact they had. It was the extirpation of a complete layer of society called cotters, with the sort of lowland equivalent of crofters. And it led to, there were more people came to America from that than from anything in the next century. But here's the genealogical problem. People dispossessed from the Highlands had been in some kind of kinship relationship with their landlords. Yeah, they were, in shorthand, they were the clansmen of their landlord. And when they left, they very often left in large family groups, or sometimes entire communities, or sometimes congregations. And they were identifiable when they got to America. They often spoke Gaelic. They kept together. They were called clannish, interestingly, by the people who were here. And they often had surnames that began with Mac or Mick or whatever. So you can find that. The Lowlands, these people had no relationship with their landlords other than an economic one. They weren't bound by family ties. They didn't all have the same surname. They were all on 19-year leases or whatever. And when they got kicked off their land, in order to put sheep on it or to open it up for prairie-type farming, 1,000 acres, put some black cattle on, and they often left in small family groups, just mother, father, kids. And because they had lowland surnames, And because they spoke Scots, which was mutually intelligible with English, they often just folded in with the English communities that they found in America. And they pretty much disappeared. And an early genealogist in America called Myra Vanderpool tried to track down these people through censuses, and she more or less had to give up. I mean, if someone has a surname like Clark or Smith, are they Lowland Scots? Are they English? Are they Welsh? Are they Irish? Are they some German Schmidt who's changed his name to fit in? Very difficult to tell. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that Americans tend to end up identifying with Highlands, because they're identifiable, and they wear colourful clothes. Whereas people who looked like that, and that is a lowland farmer, just got to America and just fitted in right away with what was then the dominant English society, largely living on the coast. The Highlanders and the Ulster Scots tended to be sometimes pushed and sometimes attracted further west towards the Appalachians, initially before crossing over. So that's, I think, the reason why we don't concentrate quite so much on the genealogy of lowland Scots, because they're often not easy to find. They're hidden in plain sight, they're invisible. Does that resonate with anybody, you think?
I think it's good that you raised that, because it's kind of apropos that we kind of started out with Charlie talking about Scott 250 and the effect that Sir Walter Scott had in branding Scotland. Because, Bruce, you're exactly right. I have a family that has partly is Highland Scot lineage, and the other part of the family is Lowland Ulster Scot. And the natural attraction is to the Highland side, because it seems to be the more Scottish branded, and the other is contaminated by the Irish. Are you Irish or are you Scottish? You're really Scottish, because that's the origin. And that story is told, I think, in a not very academic, there's some academic, but it's largely told in a different kind of romantic way. The writers oftentimes about it are journalists or people who of a military frame of mind. Therefore, they create a whole different perspective on who the Ulster Scots or Scotch-Irish were. So you're right. It's hard to get a fix on who they are. But by and large, they predominate. I mean, if you go into the southeast, the truth is the Lowland Scots, the Ulster Scots, probably predominate over the Scots. But they consider themselves to be Scots, and so they get lost in that context, and they think of themselves as Highland Scots, not as Lowland Scots. That's right, exactly right.
Anyone else this morning?
I want to try to, Gus is a master of timing, so I'm not going to turn the mic to him yet. But I want to try to twist the perspective a bit. I mean, we've been talking about this from a perspective of learners. I want to see what a teacher may have learned about this weekend. Graham, would you perhaps step in here?
Thanks. Well, I guess that one of the most significant things about this weekend that we've had a number of people talking about is the DNA. And as a working genealogist who doesn't actually deal much in the DNA, that's something I'm always anxious to learn more about. And a lot of people do ask me about it. And virtually everybody that asks me about it then goes on to say, well, I look at the DNA project for my clan and it shows this and it shows that, and they don't seem to add up at all. And I think that's one of the problems. I mean, Bruce has talked about this, and Andrew too. But it is something that, if you're lucky enough to be able to trace the Y chromosome back, you can go so far, and you can definitely find cousins, and you can trace your line back so far. So that's one side of the DNA, and I see how that works. I have my questions about how they work out exactly when one lot branches off from another in terms of time. But as a strictly genealogical thing, that's great. The other side, where you're doing the wider test, and it's taking you back to 6% of Native American and 8% of Spanish and all the rest around the world, I'm not so sure how useful that is, although it's very interesting. From my point of view, with my clan historian hat on, or my history of the clans as opposed to the strictly working genealogist, as I mentioned in what I was talking about, one of the potentially most interesting things for me about the DNA is how it may or may not prove the way that clans are connected if you go further back. One of the things that I always have to talk about when I'm doing a talk about clans, and indeed sets and set names and so on, but particularly about the origins of clans, is to ram home the question that the point that clan means family, and that clans evolve out of other clans, the parent kindreds, as I tend to call them. And the classic example of this is the MacDonalds and the MacDougalls, both being descended from Somerled, and Somerled being descended from a man called Geoffrey MacFergus, who came over from Ireland, according to the genealogies and the histories, a long time before that. A number of clans, including indeed the MacDonalds, like to think that they sprang from nowhere. Somerled is portrayed as a great hero, you know, but as a man in a cave who came out of a cave from nowhere and founded this marvelous kingdom of the Hebrides. But he was already the prince of a noble race. He didn't come out from nowhere like that. Other clans like also to claim, you know, that some hero invented them out of nothing. But in the Middle Ages, when most of these clans came, if you were going to become famous and powerful enough to have your name remembered, and for your descendants to have your name, you're going to have been somebody significant in the first place, to raise an army, to fight the battles, or to have the influence. So, to me, you know, as an academic historian looking at how clans evolved, that's one of the most interesting things. And it's my hope that DNA will be able to help a great deal in this. But for reasons that Andrew explained most clearly, it's very difficult, because we know that when you go back on the lines of many clans, we do have this problem that male lines die out, female heirs inherit, and the clan chief goes down into actually another bloodline. Just to quote the example I have to quote most often, my own chief, the Earl of Cromarty, is 4 times not a Mackenzie. His father's surname was Blunt. Go back one more generation and you've got a Luce and Gore. Go back another generation or two and you've got a Hay. Go back another generation or two and you've got a Murray, who married the daughter of an Earl of Cromarty. So 4 times this has happened in the Mackenzie line. So 4 times by blood, by genetics, John Cromarty is not a Mackenzie. Doesn't mean he's not a great and loved chief of the clan, but that's the case. So those are the problems. These are the things that I find most interesting, along, with the bread and butter genealogy. So I was pleased that we've had a lot of talk about DNA, and I've been able to learn a bit about that. But lots of other interesting stuff as well.
Thank you. One of the side benefits I found from this conference was kind of interesting in talking with one of our speakers, Professor Heddle. We found in our discussions that we were probably related. My grandmother's family are Heddles. So we'll be getting together when next time I go to Scotland to discuss the matter fully. Mary Lou?
I've gotten into DNA in the last few years, and one of the surnames that I follow is Kingston in County Cork. And there's always been an argument that the southern Kingstons in County Cork, from southern Cork, were Catholic, and they were from a different line than the ones from the more toward Cork City. And they did the DNA project, and they have found that all of them that have come so far, except the Earl of Cork, whose name was Kingston, but was taken as Kingston, that all of the others stem from a man in Middle England, and they all match.
Thank you.
wanted to pick up on a point that Graham was making. There were a number of people we had hoped to have join us at the conference this year who were not available. One of them was Senator Jim Webb, who you know has written a book about the Ulster Scots Irish called Born Fighting. He wasn't available. Maybe on another occasion we can get him to come because he's a great speaker and good writer. He knows about that. It's his people. But the point I really wanted to pick up on was this business about the origins of the West Highland clans. One of the people we had hoped to have here was my good friend Keith McGregor, who's done a lot of work on this. And he was unavailable for family reasons. He and Bruce Dury, when we were in Washington for Tartan Day a couple of years ago, talked at great length about the origins of the Western clans. If you are able, through DNA, to take them back, and that has been done for some of them, you can find the point at which they diverged from each other. And it tends to support the whole Dalriadic immigration story, not necessarily the 4 or 5 brothers, but maybe. But it's very interesting to be able to take them back to the Bronze Age, or certainly the Iron Age, and find the commonality. And DNA helps us do that. And without it, we would just be left with myth and story, and we wouldn't know if it was real or not. But there's a great deal going on. I think it's very, very interesting, and it hasn't stopped. I think we're going to be able, from what I'm told, in the next 10 years, know a great deal more about the origins of these ethnic strains that together ended up making Scotland what it is and who it is. Bruce was talking about the fact that they're all still there. And you can find these ethnic strains in the population. If we can take them back to where they came from before they arrived in Scotland, and who was close to who before they diverged geographically and politically, it'd be very, very interesting to do. And I think that's coming. Am I right?
Another person that we had hoped to come but wasn't able was David Hackett Fisher, who, a historian. I think he is British, but he teaches here on the East Coast. Wrote a book, Albion Seed. So just if you think this is all about the past, his thesis is that there were 4 major waves of British migration to this country. They all originated in distinct regions of Great Britain, and they all migrated to distinct regions of the United States, and they all came with distinct cultural patterns, and that those patterns today predominate in that region both in terms of social practices and political behavior. And so, we think of this being the past, but it shows how much the past still determines the future. And so to study it actually creates insights about what we face today. Gus?
I'm not sure I can follow that. I'm simply going to quote 2 people. I think it speaks to the things we've been saying throughout this conference. Robert Louis Stevenson, who's another, of course, great Scottish writer. We've mentioned Burns and we've mentioned Scott. Robert Louis Stevenson said, "The mark of the Scot is that he cherishes the memory of his forebears, and there burns alive in him a sense of identity, even to the 20th generation." That says a lot about what we've been talking about today. Now, a non-Scot, the African-American writer and activist James Baldwin, said, "If you know from whence you came, there really is no limit to where you can go." I think if we put those 2 things together, we have a sense of what we've been talking about at this conference. I was particularly inspired by Andrew's presentation on Friday evening. John and I have had opposing views of what it means to be Scottish. Not necessarily the meat that's on the bones, but perhaps how you get to having meat and bones in the first place. I think mine is much more of an idea. John's is more of a scientific evolution of history. Andrew, you found a way of blending the two together, which I found very inspiring, and I thank you very much for that. I also want to thank you, John, for your conversation last night. I particularly enjoyed the talk about the possibilities of the future for this conference, for organizations like ours, and for my own challenges at work. And I enjoy what happens at this conference between the lines, when there are no speakers speaking, when we have a chance to have a cup of coffee and get to know one another and find out about the work we all do and how we can link up together. So I thank all of you for your conversations and your friendship, and I look forward to renewing that friendship often through the years. That's about all I want to say this morning.
Thank you. I think at this point, we're just about to wrap up. Dr. Drury? One last.
Really interesting what you were saying about cultural permanence, in America. I was having a discussion with someone in North Carolina, and I said, maybe you can explain to me how the people who came here were largely either Presbyterians or Episcopalians. How come the place is awash with Baptist churches, right? Every crossroads in North Carolina's got 3 Baptist churches on it. Yeah? And he said, I've no idea whether this is correct or not, but it's funny. He said, the reason is that it was all about, could you get preachers there? Could you get ministers there? Baptist preachers were prepared to go on horseback. Presbyterian ministers waited until there were wagon roads, and the Episcopalian guys didn't turn up until there were railways, Pullman service, and a decent dining car. Maybe so. But I want to give you a number to think about. Take this number away and lie in bed tonight and worry about it. Each of us has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. If you work that back 250 years, which is to say back to 1560, right, just to pick a number, because that's when church records start, you find out each of us has about 300,000 ancestors in 1560. That is the same as the adult population of Scotland at the time. Are we therefore all related to each other at this quite small distance, yeah? Now, it's not quite like that because of distant cousin marriages and so on, but we have a saying in Scotland, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. Everybody is the same. And it really puts into perspective that we, all of us in this room, could probably find some common ancestor. Who's going to pick up that geological task?
Thank you. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the speakers who were here this entire conference to spend their time and effort and the information with us. I appreciate that greatly. I'd also like to thank